that puts the professor at that institution, at that university that goes back to what is the better ways of thinking about this stuff, in the box of having to deal with, I have to do this or I won't get paid, or my students won't get paid, because it is often the grants that pay the salary of a research professor. It is very much not the university itself. So there's a lot of times that we talk about things going on and what have you, and sometimes we forget to include what do you do about it. And a lot of the problems that are in higher ed and STEM and what have you, postmodernist stuff, amongst other things, it tends to we tend to sometimes just bemoan things. And so I'm trying going forward to make sure that there's some discussion of what do you do about this crap? What do you do to help fix higher ed? Because as I've said many times, the universities currently are where we train the next generation of scientists. And so it needs to be approached carefully. It needs to be approached to figure out how the heck do we go about fixing this mess, or changing things from what they are. On November 4th and 5th of this year, I attended the Stanford Academic Freedom Conference, guest post on the Heterodox STEM Substack. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is that there's some lovely suggestions in here about what to do about it, and I want to expound upon it a little bit more and add to it. Over 150 professors from universities all over the world gathered at Stanford that weekend to discuss the disturbing trend in academia to suppress free speech and free inquiry. Yeah, and you see a bunch of them pictured in here. Some faces that actually might be very familiar, and others that are not. I do believe this is one gentleman right now here, Jordan Peterson, which if you are not giving some support to Jordan Peterson, I suggest you do that, because he isn't currently dealing with his own profession trying to take away his license because he expressed his opinion on social media. Canada. I think it's what is it? The Ontario College of Psychologists, I believe. I forget the name of the governing body, the quasi-governmental body in Canada that supposedly helps keep people safe from psychologists that are intending to cause harm to their clients. Anyway. There were many speakers from a wide range of disciplines, including some world-renowned public intellectuals such as Steven Pinker, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Peter Thiel, Gad Saad, and many, many more. You can find this full speaker list here, as well as outline of the various conference sessions. I was there neither as an academic nor as a world-famous personality, but rather simply as a lowly podcaster who had talked his way into a highly coveted invitation to attend, mostly as an observer. I didn't ask any questions when I was there because I was intimidated by credentials of all the other people who stood up and asked questions. I would be in that same boat, to be perfectly honest. There were a lot of really great people who were at this thing. Let's see. But maybe not asking any questions was a benefit in a way, because I got to listen and take it all in without having to worry about sounding smart. And listen, I did. Not only did I attend all the sessions live in person, but when I got home from the conference, I watched all 14 hours of video of the sessions and was listening really carefully, because I'd given myself the job of calling the best clips from the conference for a podcast I was producing about the event. I will have to go listen to that. My goal for this podcast episode was to give people who were not able to attend the conference in person the feeling that they had been there live. I not only played some of the best clips from the conference, but I also interjected between the clips to talk about them and give my thoughts, so the listener might have the feeling that they were attending the conference with me, and they were discussing what was happening over coffee between the sessions. If you'd like to have the full audio podcast experience, you can find it here. But if you don't have 100 minutes to spare, read on, my friends, because in this essay, I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you the 7 solutions these public intellectuals proposed at the conference to address the problems with academic freedom. It's easy to complain about the problem, and there was a certain amount of that going on at the conference. I can't blame people. To be perfectly honest, I cannot blame people if they started complaining. It totally makes sense to me. But there was no wallowing, in my opinion. Instead, people were laying out the problems in full detail so that better solutions could be found. Overall, I fear that there were 7 major solutions offered. All right, here we go. Pursuing legal options and using the courts and government to protect and advance academic freedom. Now, Greg Lukianov's Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, I believe it is, but now, employs an army of pro bono attorneys to defend professors from the suppression of free speech by their universities. Amy Wax from Penn Law suggested withholding federal funds from universities which don't adopt First Amendment principles into their charters, in analogy with Titles 6 and 9. Okay. I do agree. The law needs to be put into force here. The challenge with some of these is, unfortunately, a lot of professors are, if they're doing research and teaching at the same time, they're grant professors, particularly if they're STEM professors, and unfortunately things like NSF are incorporating more DEI related things, which unfortunately comes with ideological litmus tests. So, on the one hand, you got to get the law and figure out how to push back this. Okay, here's my good question. Here's my question. If you are a good lawyer listening to this, I want to know your thoughts. Because you have things like NSF, Department of Energy, among others, pushing and requiring that you put in DI statements and what have you. Often these are federal agencies that are putting out requests for proposals. This is coming from the federal government. What is the legal case that you would make for someone who's competing for that grant or what have you, to be able to say that I can't in good conscience do this because I do not agree with the way the government has defined it. I hold fundamental disagreement, and yet you're denying me the opportunity to compete for this grant because of that. How would you go about that? Because I've talked about this before. You have NSF, you have DOE, you have a whole bunch of things that are doing this now. And in Canada, I think I talked about this on a different episode, in Canada there have been professors who have lost grants because they didn't do a sufficient job of including DEI requirements. What do you do? Because if DEI is not critical to your grant about physics or chemistry or hydrology, for instance, but you're getting shafted for the grant because of this stuff that is really more of a reflection of ideology than it is the scientific practice. That's a question I would have for a lawyer. How do you go about doing it? Not with the university, but with the federal government, who does the requests for proposals. My question. Create alternative institutions dedicated to open inquiry and academic freedom. Neil Ferguson from Hoover argued passionately that it was only through the creation of alternative institutions that academic freedom could be protected, and he touted the new University of Austin, at which he is a founding member, as one of the institutions paving the way. Lee Justin from Rutgers made the case with graphs, charts, and data. I gotta look at that, by the way. That academia is pretty much lost to progressive ideology, and that only alternative institutions stand a chance. What he calls islands of academic freedom and scientific integrity. Same question applies as to the previous. Because some of these progressive ideological requirements are being included in requests for proposals for funding grants from the different federal agencies. Yes, have the university institution that is against this stuff, against having those kinds of ideological litmus tests, whether they come from progressives or conservatives. But how are you going to fight that? How do you deal with it when it comes from the government? Because the government, in this case, may not always be there to protect you with this. Educating the public at large about these issues and convincing more and more parents to pull their children from mainstream institutions. John Ellis from the University of California made the case that the customers of universities, i.e. the parents who are paying the tuition, must be shown that what they are funding is not an education for their children, but rather an indoctrination into political activism. Yes, and let me add one thing. Here. Also, talk to the alumni of the universities about this, particularly the very wealthy alumni who fund the different universities and tell them what their dollars are going toward with these different things. Tell them what their dollars are going toward. Because that's actually, for me personally, for my own alma mater, I'm not paying them a dime until they can prove to me that they're about free speech, free expression, and academic freedom. I did that with my alma mater already. I told you, just like every time they write me asking for money, I just write them back and say, what have you done about this? Have you done this? Have you done that? Are you protecting students and professors' rights to speak freely? Training students in the habits of open inquiry. This is more bottom-up approach. John Rose from Duke University leads a program there about open inquiry, political polarization, and conservatism, which has proven to be immensely popular with students. He believes the students want free and open inquiry and that this natural tendency should be encouraged and developed. Actually, yes, but I would add something very specific for scientists in this, and I've talked about it before. Scientists need training on the philosophy of science. They need training on the normative principles of science. Communality, universalism, disinterestedness, organized skepticism. Kudos, if you will. Remember the acronym KUDOS and you remember the four. But they need that kind of training in that. Students in general, the other thing I would add, what is the specific coursework that you would get into? And I'm going to have to go look up this John Rose person because this would be great thing to look into to see what's going on and maybe give them a highlight here. But coursework that might need to be taught, or maybe for you parents who are interested in homeschooling, here's another thought for you specifically. Aside from the things that I just mentioned, particularly if you're getting, like teenagers, high school level kind of thing, also go into cats popping open cabinet doors. I apologize. She did it again. Go into with your students, with your kids in homeschool, constructive disagreement, conflict management, and conflict resolution. How do you go about doing those things? And don't just teach it, but model it for your kids, right? If you're homeschooling your own kids, model it for them. And I think that's probably going to be the way to go, is homeschooling more so than public education. But if you're not seeing your kids get that in public education or in private school, teach it yourself. Your kids. And for university professors, I'd love to see this. That's why I actually like a related program is Bucknell's Open Discourse Coalition. Open Discourse Coalition, yeah, that's what it's called. I really like that because they get two completely opposing arguments together in the same room and have a nice debate about it, and yet they're still jovial, still friendly, it makes it easy to remind people that you need to see the human in someone whom you're debating. Let's see. Restructuring the university to embed a sort of judicial branch within the administration whose main purpose is to adjudicate questions related to freedom of speech and thought. Tyler Cohen from George Mason and Niall Ferguson from Hoover discussed why universities must have such a third branch whose main purpose is to defend the boundaries of free inquiry from the encroachments of both students and faculty. That's actually quite a unique idea. A lot of universities have sort of two branches where you have the administration, you have, your president or chancellor or whomever it is, and you have a board of trustees that works with them. Sort of like an executive governing body. You have the president and the cabinet, or the board of trustees, and a lot of places sometimes has more influence than the president does on things going on, sometimes less. Depends on the structure of that individual university. But then you also have faculty and student senates. Faculty, staff, and student senates, respectively, like 3 different ones. But there's not really a third branch for adjudication, necessarily. Adjudication of issues, generally speaking, is often just left up to the executive administration. So it would be curious to see how you would structure a judicial branch of the university here. And, if we're talking about like separate but equal powers kind of thing with checks and balances, that might be a very interesting way to approach it, actually. And particularly give it that power to adjudicate those questions. Twitter, podcasts, YouTube, and all other ways we can express ourselves freely using the internet. Yes. And you know what? I'm going to make a point in a second once I get to the last one, but Tyler Cohen made a passionate and persuasive case that academics today enjoy more freedom of speech than ever before, but only if they're willing to take their ideas outside of the university and into the wide world via social media and other platforms such as Substack. It's not always easy to do, and there are pitfalls, but it's worth the effort. The Substack you're reading right now is a perfect example of this. Exactly. My YouTube channel. Hi. As many of you know, many times over, I, outside of this, do work at a major university for a living. So, yeah, get out there. You've seen the Rogue Journal Club podcast. You've seen this show. There's other podcasts out there. The Dark Horse, there's also Dark Horse podcast. There's, of course, this guy's podcast, The Genius of Thomas Sowell, which I'm sure is fabulous. I have not listened to his podcast yet, but I'm probably going to go do that myself. Read, listen, share. Get out there. It's actually not that hard to start a YouTube channel, to be truthful. All you need is a good mic and a webcam, and then you can figure out the software. Like the software I'm using right now, OBS Studio, is entirely free. Free software. Now, it's user-driven, which means it has its bugs on occasion, but it is free software. StreamYard when I've been streaming. That, base package for StreamYard if you want to do live streams. That's free. Kinds of things. So, we could do that. The final thing here I just want to make a point on, and I'm going to link the last two together. Mustering personal courage and fighting the good fight. Jordan Peterson talked about the importance of speaking up for yourself as a way of avoiding internal resentment, which results from keeping your mouth shut. Gad Saad admonished his fellow attendees to speak up with boldness, and if we all did that, the problem would go away quickly. Amy Wax laid out her case for being disagreeable, for being contrarian, for being willing to question everything, for not being conflict avoidant, for having a high tolerance for pain and insult, and for having a willingness to make new friends. So, this one and the last one actually are really tied together, because one thing I find for myself at least, and again, this is somewhat anecdotal, this is pretty much anecdotal, but when you get to the point where you're doing the reading on this kind of stuff, and then you're talking about it on a YouTube channel, and then faced with the situation in your professional or your personal life about it, it does actually make it somewhat easier once you get started doing it a little bit at a time to talk about it when the troubles come up. I mentioned it when I had a great conversations last week about a bunch of these topics where STEM scientists who I was talking to were actually pissed. They're just afraid to say anything, which, get up there and do it. And it also makes it easier to start having some of those conversations in other places that are obviously not as out there as YouTube. So I agree with that. Just start talking about it. Just start asking questions about it. And Jordan's also right, because if you're not speaking up and you're just bottling the frustration that you feel inside, you're kind of blocking the pressure relief valve on that pressure cooker that is you. And that's not a healthy thing. Because eventually that's going to burst, and it'll probably burst in a way where you get yourself in a lot of trouble with it in ways you didn't intend, at any rate. So, let's get into this a little bit, and we'll finish this up. So, those are the 7 possible solutions offered at the conference that I could discern. Which one is the best? In my humble opinion, we're going to need all 7 solutions to make this work. There is rarely just one solution to a complex problem, and this problem is so big and so complicated that we're going to have to attack it from every possible angle. You know the riddle about the 800-pound gorilla. Where does the 800-pound gorilla sit? Anywhere it wants to. An 800-pound gorilla is a metaphor for a person or organization so powerful that it can act without regard to the rights of others or the law. The so-called captured institutions of the West is our generation's 800-pound gorilla. It's our King Kong. And I'm happy to say I met quite a few Godzillas at the Stanford Conference in November. So, I agree. I would add another solution. That the one thing here is that, as I said, it's the one critique I have of what Alan said and what was said at the Stanford Conference based on this that needs to be addressed. You can make the new institutions. Yes, do it. Absolutely. I'm not disagreeing with that. But if a lot of your professors, particularly your research professors who start at that new institution, have to get grants from the federal government or try to get grants from the federal government, when that federal government is pushing the same progressive ideology as part of its RFPs, the requirements for successful proposals, or no, requests for proposals, but in those requests, and they often include criterion for what's a successful RFP. If they're including these things, like you have to have something about diversity. You have to have a diversity statement. You have to have a DEI statement. That puts the professor at that institution, at that university that goes back to what is the better ways of thinking about this stuff, in the box of having to deal with, I have to do this or I won't get paid, or my students won't get paid, because it is often the grants that pay the salary of a research professor. It is very much not the university itself, in most cases. There are some exceptions to that, as always. But thinking of that aspect, that is the one thing I did not see here. And so I want to hear it. I'm going to repeat my earlier question. If there's a legal mind, let us say that National Science Foundation, DOE, NOAA, any number of the institutions puts out a request for proposals, and in the criteria for what proposals are going to be accepted, what has to be in the proposal packet in here, because there's a lot of things that have to go into it, they demand a statement on how you're going to include DEI in your proposal. And if you think I'm just being hyperbolic about this, I am not, because this is already a standard request of the Department of Energy. Of any grant proposals put to the Department of Energy, they now require this thing. I forget what they call it. Forget the exact phrasing they have. They call it peer, but I talked about it in a different video. But it's equivalent. It's effectively a DEI statement. Not just a DEI statement, a plan for how you're going to implement it as part of this grant you get. And that, what they want, requirements that they have, what they want is effectively against my own fundamental worldview. What is the legal case for getting them to not include those kinds of things in requests for proposals and the requirements for successful grants? That's the question I have for a legal case, and I may not have phrased it very well, so please just, let me know in the comments if I didn't phrase it very well. But that's what I wanted to wrap out for you, because that's the major critique I have of the solutions put forward. But in general, I like a bunch of the solutions put forward. I definitely didn't think of the third branch of the university kind of idea. That might actually be really interesting to see how that would work. But this kind of stuff is necessary, because I do worry about what this is going to do to STEM in the long run. So, with that said, what do you think of the solutions? Comment below. What do you think are the solutions to this madness as we have now? And do you think the 7 solutions that are put forward here, again, link in the description, are going to be useful, or are they just a mess, or what have you? Like this video on the way out the door if you liked it. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, everybody.